Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say a few words to your conference, and in particular on retail prices and their regulation. What I'd like to do is, first of all, to cover something which is in a sense very basic but absolutely critical, and that's, prices should relate to costs. So what exactly are the costs of electricity that customers should pay, and how are those costs, more importantly, likely to change, and change pretty radically over the next decade or so. And these changes need to be reflected in regulation, and they're going to have profound impacts on the ordinary people who have to find the money to heat their houses and keep themselves warm and use the basic universal requirement of electricity. So let's start with the costs. In the current electricity world, and it's been true for 50 or 100 years, the costs are pretty simple. It's not rocket science, it's a homogeneous product. Electricity is always the same stuff. And those costs are essentially the wholesale costs, and those in turn depend upon the fuel inputs that are used to generate the electricity, which is then sold in wholesale markets, plus the distribution and transmission system costs, and then a bit more on the end for doing the customer servicing, sending them the bill, doing the metering and so on. And that's it. And the price of electricity should, and in the past it often has, simply follow those trends. So if you know what the coal, and indeed at some stages the gas now costs, you would know what the marginal cost of fuel is. That would tell you what the wholesale price is. Regulation would fix the system costs. And it's pretty obvious to work out what metering and billing and so on costs. So out pops the answer. So you might think, all very simple. That's what the price should be. But the thing is that across Europe, that's no longer true. And it's no longer true because the structure of the costs of the industry have begun to change, but not the prices. So if we think about the wholesale market, the assumption here is that what you're doing to produce electricity is burn variable cost fuels, fossil fuels in particular. Well, many of the new technologies coming into the system are essentially zero marginal cost. They don't have a fuel input cost. And these new ways of generating electricity are there to serve what is becoming a digital economy. So in the past, our economy was labour driven and big factories, workers, etc., etc. And these would be heavy energy users. Now, as we look ahead across Europe in the next 10, 20, 30 years, we're talking about a world in which there'll be robots, there'll be 3D printing, there'll be artificial intelligence. And the thing about these changes, though they're coming slowly, is they're all digital, and everything that's digital is electric, and everything that's electric is gradually becoming more and more zero marginal cost. So the guts of the cost structure of the industry is changing. And with that, so should the price, and so should the regulation. So in this new world, what you're buying when you buy electricity is not, a bit of coal or a bit of gas turned into power through a wholesale market. You're buying capacity. It's a bit like buying broadband services. The capacity is the solar panel, the wind farm, the nuclear power station, and much more in the future, the next generation of solar panels. And you either have the capacity or you don't. And we see across Europe that there are times when there's too much of this stuff at zero marginal cost, and then it has to be dumped. And then there are points when there isn't so much. So if you envisage this new world with essentially zero marginal cost generation becoming a bigger and bigger bit, what happens is that of the total cost of electricity, of the, say, 100% of the total costs, less and less of it is wholesale, and gradually that's diminishing, and in the very long run it might end up being close to zero. Now you might say, well, of course we're going to need some backup generation, there'll always be the need for peaking supply, but in a way that's becoming increasingly like insurance rather than spot wholesale product. And it's also built into the fabric of the new technologies in people's houses and in factories, where you can vary demand as opposed to the last century in which demand has been given. So looking into the future electricity industry, the world I describe in my new book called The Burnout, this is a world in which the power supplies are capacity driven. It's like the economics of the internet and the broadband. There is no real purpose for the wholesale market, and the demand side is active and not passive. So given that world, what should we do about retail prices? Well, retail prices should follow costs, and therefore retail prices should be much more driven by capacity, by fixed costs, and much less driven by variable wholesale prices. And this is quite radical, because what it means is the whole construction of the internal energy market in Europe is focusing on something which is increasingly less relevant to the market itself and therefore to customers. What the internal energy market should be about is about capacity and the pricing of capacity and the competitive bidding for capacity in the new energy markets of the future. So what should regulators do? What should consumers expect? Well, the fact is that most of these costs that suppliers take on in order to deliver the electricity to customers are fixed and given. Most suppliers can't do anything about the price of capacity that emerges from the capacity auction. They can't do much about the transmission or the distribution costs agreed with the regulators, and they can't do much about the use of system charges. So if we think what the, if you like, the default tariff would be in this market, the default tariff would be a residual, which is some indexation of the wholesale prices for as long as they're important, plus the capacity payments, plus the feed-in tariffs for the renewables, plus the distribution charge, plus the transmission charge, plus what's left in terms of what the managers of the supply businesses do, and that's basically billing, metering and customer services, for which there should be a margin. Now roll it forward one stage further. If that's a default tariff, and in my view that should be required for all suppliers to offer as a default tariff to customers across Europe, if that is the case, and we think through how customers will benefit from this in the future, the competition's going to be about that retail margin, about dealing with the customer, that wholesale retail cost pass-through billing metering margin. And in many countries it's quite big. It's like 2, 3, 4, 5% of the total cost. In some countries as high as 9%. But in the future, how's that energy going to be supplied? Through the broadband hub, through the smart metering and the smart broadband hub that will control household services. And that's where the future isn't going to be with people just supplying electricity or just electricity and supply and gas supply. Doing just that's going to, in 10 years' time or so, look pretty quaint. It's going to be done by the Amazons, the Googles, and a whole set of internet-based companies that provide household services. Then the margin might be 0.1, not 5%. And that really would be good news for consumers. That would be a great deal. And also, that would be a relatively low carbon world. So the job of the Commission in thinking about the future of the internal energy market, the job of the regulators in looking after customers now, and the job of the policy framework to facilitate competition, those are all out there and big opportunities which should be taken forward now for the future world and not looking out the back window of the car at the past world that we've lived through. And that's what I set out in my new book, The Burnout, and that's what we should be getting on with. Thank you very much indeed.